Earning your degree online doesn't mean you have to go about it alone. At Capella University, we're here to support you when you're ready. From enrollment counselors who get to know you and your goals, to academic coaches who can help you form a plan to stay on track. We care about your success and are dedicated to helping you pursue your goals. Going back to school is a big step, but having support at every step of your academic journey can make a big difference. Imagine your future differently at capella.edu.
With the $5 meal deal at McDonald's, you pick a McDouble or a McChicken, then get a small fry, a small drink, and a 4-piece McNuggets. That's a lot of McDonald's for not a lot of money.
Price and participation may vary. For a limited time only.
Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse on your favorite streaming platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. You can follow the Red Treehouse on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, X, Threads, and Facebook at Red Treehouse Pod. And now you can find the Red Treehouse on Patreon. Join the Red Treehouse community for as little as $3 per month and receive exclusive member benefits, including personal shoutouts, early access to episodes, bonus episodes, and more. Simply go to patreon.com/Red Treehouse. As always, if you have a scary story or topic you'd like me to feature on an upcoming episode, email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. Important note, sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. Let's start with 2 questions. First, what comes to mind when you think of ghosts? For me, I immediately think of Ed and Lorraine Warren, the Enfield Poltergeist, and the Amityville Horror House, each of which we will explore in upcoming episodes of the Red Treehouse. And while these are no doubt among the most famous and well-known hauntings and paranormal investigators, they're not the topic of today's episode. Here's the second question. What comes to mind when you hear the word poltergeist? For me, I think of 2 things: the horror movie series and an aggressive ghost. If the second one came to mind, you're right on track. In the mid-1970s, a woman named Doris Bither claimed her home was haunted. And if that weren't enough, she claimed something else: that the ghosts were assaulting her. According to Doris Bither, the entities in her home moved objects, caused terrible odors, created strange noises with no point of origin, and perhaps most terrifying, she claimed the spirits were physically and sexually assaulting her. A content warning before we go any further. This episode contains descriptions of physical and sexual assault. Listener discretion is advised. The Haunting of Doris Bither is both terrifying and controversial, with believers claiming the haunting was real, and skeptics claiming Doris Bither was making it all up. Regardless of which side you fall on, the story was compelling enough to be turned into a book, published in 1978, and a movie, released in 1982. In this episode of The Red Treehouse, we're going to explore the controversial and still terrifying Haunting of Doris Bither. Was she truly terrorized and assaulted by invisible entities? Or Were the supposed hauntings something else entirely? I'll tell the story. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. Today, the home at 11547 Braddock Drive in Culver City, California, can best be described as modest and quaint. 50 years ago, though, in 1974, Doris Bither was living there with her 4 children. At the time, the home could best be described as ramshackle and falling apart, and had been condemned twice by the city of Los Angeles. Around the time she moved in, Doris heard a knock at her front door. When she opened it, she found an elderly woman standing there. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, the woman explained she'd lived there decades before when she was a young girl, and cautioned Doris to leave the house immediately, as she'd experienced scary poltergeist phenomenon, including flickering lights and objects moving by an unseen hand. The woman, likely in her 70s, was convinced the home was haunted by evil spirits. And just as suddenly as she appeared, she walked away, deep into the night, never to be seen or heard from again. And though she initially dismissed the woman offhand, it wouldn't be long before Doris Bither and her kids began experiencing something terrifying. Shortly after the visit, Doris was browsing at a local bookstore when she overheard a conversation between 2 men, Dr. Barry Taff and his associate, Dr. Kerry Gaynor. Taff was a doctor in psychophysiology, a biomedical engineer, and a well-known parapsychologist. Mustering up the courage, Doris approached the men and explained she needed help. Her house was haunted, and she and her children were being attacked by the spirits residing in the home. Dr. Taff agreed to visit the home and interview Doris and her children. He wasn't certain if the house was haunted or not, and he was likely thinking it was no different than those he'd done hundreds of times before. Upon arrival, Dr. Taff was surprised at the condition of the home, and he was equally surprised to find Doris Bither living there with 4 kids, 3 sons, and a young daughter. Doris, a single mother, was a fiercely private woman who refused to provide significant details about her past. From what I understand, when investigating a possible haunting, it is important for paranormal investigators to get as much background information on the subject as possible. Despite this, Doris preferred to keep most of her personal history private, though she disclosed having been the victim of childhood abuse and, as an adult, was continuing to navigate the trauma. She also reported being physically abused at some point in the past and struggling with substance abuse issues. It is believed Doris may have had previous experiences with the supernatural, as it was reported she'd participated in seances and may have been involved with the occult. For Dr. Taff, These admissions did not eliminate the possibility of the home being haunted, but he took note of them as they could possibly explain some of the strange phenomenon Doris Bither was experiencing. Despite his initial skepticism, Dr. Taff continued with the investigation and was stunned to learn Doris's 4 children also claimed to have experienced the attacks. During her interview, Doris claimed she, quote, recalled hearing the spirits banging on walls, lights flickering, and even moving around the house, end quote. Then, Doris Bither claimed something extraordinary and terrifying. The spirits in the home physically and sexually assaulted her. Though I gave one earlier, I'll offer another content warning. The following contains descriptions of physical and sexual assault. Listener discretion is advised. Doris claimed one evening she was in her bedroom reading and settling down for the night. The children were already asleep, and she was doing her best to relax after a hectic day. Suddenly, quote, without warning, a trio of nearly invisible paranormal entities appeared to her. The smaller 2 branched off and grabbed her arms and held her down. The third, a considerably large and formidable entity, spread her legs and sexually assaulted her. Unable to scream and paralyzed by complete terror and fear, Doris had no idea what was happening to her. Over the next several days, at completely random times, Doris was assaulted by the same trio of entities, end quote. The attacks against Doris, quote, left marks on her body indicative of a rape, including bruises on her inner thighs and throat, end quote. Another article stated, quote, over the next several days, at completely random times, Doris was sexually assaulted by the same trio of entities. At one instance, her eldest son saw his mother being dragged across her room. He attempted to intervene, and instead was assaulted by the unseen entities and thrown completely across the room, end quote. These assaults became known as spectral rape. Despite Doris's astounding claims, Dr. Taff did not investigate this phenomenon, as the attacks occurred prior to his arrival at the home in August 1974. In fact, after the initial interview, Dr. Taff referred Doris to a psychiatrist, as he believed she may have been suffering from significant mental health issues. It seems they weren't convinced by Doris's claims of the home being haunted. Less than 2 weeks later, Dr. Taff received a phone call from Doris. She pleaded with him for help and claimed the poltergeist phenomenon was not only increasing, but had also been witnessed by several other people. Intrigued by the possibility of the haunting, Dr. Taff was convinced to return to the home and investigate. When he arrived at the home, there were several people outside and around. They claimed to see strange lights outside the house and dark figures out of the corner of their eyes. But when they turned to look at them, the figures disappeared. They also claimed a horrible stench of rotting meat was coming from somewhere inside Doris's home. Dr. Taff and Dr. Gaynor went inside the house and initially didn't notice anything strange. To them, the home seemed normal, and devoid of anything supernatural. Then, they went into Doris's bedroom and immediately noticed something strange. The room was freezing. Thinking the AC was turned on high, they pulled a thermometer from their supplies and were stunned to see it read the same temperature as the rest of the house. Then, they smelled it. Rotting meat. Though still skeptical, they figured something was going on in the home, though they weren't sure what. As they moved from the bedroom back to the main living area, they began asking questions to those in the home. As they talked and took notes, a kitchen cabinet suddenly swung open, and the frying pan, which was sitting in the cabinet, came flying and landed on the floor near them. Thinking the cabinet may have been rigged with a spring or wire, Taff and Gaynor went to inspect, and were stunned to find nothing. Then, Doris claimed the spirits were nearby. Dr. Gaynor immediately began taking photographs as Doris pointed at doorways and spaces. He was determined to capture photographic evidence of whatever spirits were residing in the home, then considered the holy grail of paranormal investigating. Dr. Gaynor approached this as scientifically as possible. Whenever Doris claimed the spirit was gone from a room or area, he took a picture. Then, when Doris claimed the spirit returned, he took another picture. Astoundingly, when Dr. Gaynor took a photo after the spirit left the room, it came out clear. But when he took a photo after the spirit returned to the room, it came out distorted. By now, Dr. Taff and Dr. Gaynor were convinced the home was haunted. As the investigation continued, Doris's 4 children all claimed to have been attacked by the spirits in the home. One article, containing an interview with Brian Harris, Doris's middle son, stated, quote, "We all experienced some form of attack. There was the pushing, biting, and scratching being done to us. There were about 4 entities in the home, and they made themselves known by appearing all the time. I think it took a lot of energy for them to do that." End quote. He described the entities as follows, quote, "It was always like a fog, like a human, but not quite." End quote. The 4 children named the entity Mr. Who's It, and Dr. Taff noted how similar their stories were. The stories matched, as did their descriptions of the entities in the home. Something interesting. It wasn't just Doris and her children who claimed to experience supernatural events in the home. Multiple witnesses came forward claiming to have strange feelings of being watched, hearing, quote, "phantom noises like loud voices and banging on the walls," end quote. Another eyewitness, quote, "claimed to see Bither being thrown around like a rag doll." Another witness account reported one of Bither's sons attempting to intervene with one of the spirits and was attacked to the point where his arm was broken, end quote. During the investigation, Dr. Taff attempted to goad the spirits into revealing themselves, and he noted the home, quote, "had an overwhelming feeling of pressure inside it," end quote. Doris called out the ghosts and shouted aloud when, quote, "suddenly a green mist manifested in the room with a couple dozen investigators. An arc of light shot above her head as a very large man's torso formed in the midst," end quote. Several famous photographs were taken during the investigation, including one that appears to show Doris sitting on a bed and an arc of light hanging over her head. Concerned the photographs may have been optical illusions or tricks of light, Dr. Taff and Dr. Gaynor closed and bolted the windows, casting an eerie darkness throughout the home. By now, over 20 people claimed they'd experienced the scary phenomenon. One night, Dr. Taff received a phone call from Doris. She was crying and hysterical. After helping to calm her down, Doris explained one of the bolts securing the windows had been ripped out, flew, and almost hit her in the head. Though somewhat skeptical, Dr. Taff was certain Doris would not have been able to do this herself. She pleaded with him to return to the home. And when he returned, Dr. Taff immediately noticed glowing orbs moving through the air. And the smell of rotting meat had returned. Now convinced the spirits were present, the investigators called out for them to show themselves and rip something off the wall. At first, nothing happened. Then, they heard it. A ripping sound coming from somewhere in the back of the house. When they went to investigate, another bolt flew from out of the window and hit Doris in the forehead. Though unhurt, Doris was shaken up by this. Then, another bolt flew out and landed in front of them. Suddenly, an old fuse box tore off the wall and came towards Doris's head, but thankfully missed. It seemed Dr. Taff and Dr. Gaynor hit the supernatural jackpot. Doris's home was a paranormal hotspot. But then, just as quickly as it stirred up, it died down. Dr. Taff and Dr. Gaynor noticed that when Doris's drinking increased, so too did the supposed paranormal phenomenon. But when Doris was sober, the paranormal phenomenon died down. And even though the investigation went on for 10 weeks, it was eventually shut down. After the investigation shut down, Doris moved to Carson, California, about 30 minutes south of Culver City. Despite the change in scenery, it appears the poltergeist activity followed Doris to her new home, and she reported pots, pans, and kitchen utensils flying around the house, doors opening and closing on their own, appliances turning on and off, and strange noises at all hours of the day and night. Once again, she called in the investigators, and sure enough, the poltergeist activity picked up where it left off. A vase flew from a ledge and smashed on the floor in front of them. And something truly terrifying. They heard low, deep breathing and footsteps on the floor. But not just any ordinary footsteps. A hard step and a dragging, almost like the spirit was limping around the house. Then, just like before, the strange phenomenon stopped, effectively ending the investigation. Doris eventually moved from Carson, California, to another home, and investigators lost touch with her. To this day, the Doris Bither haunting remains one of the most controversial and polarizing cases, maybe ever. Believers are resolute that whatever Doris experienced was both terrifying and traumatic, and her history of substance abuse should not discredit her experiences. For them, they hold firmly to the possibility that Doris was tormented by an evil spirit known as an incubus. According to one article, an incubus is, quote, a demon in male form that seeks to have sexual intercourse with sleeping women. The corresponding spirit in female form is called a succubus, end quote. Those who believe Doris Bither's claims are convinced she was assaulted by a demonic entity, and that these attacks lasted for some time. Skeptics, however, have a host of alternate theories to explain Doris's claim, including sleep paralysis, shoddy investigation techniques, and confirmation bias. Some point to Doris's trauma and claim she was somehow manifesting the strange occurrences in her own mind. They claim she had a psychosomatic disorder, which according to the Cleveland Clinic is, quote, a psychological condition involving the occurrence of physical symptoms, usually lacking a medical explanation. People with this condition may have excessive thoughts, feelings, or concerns about the symptoms, which affects their ability to function well, end quote. Other skeptics believe Dr. Taff and Dr. Gaynor used shoddy investigation techniques, and that it's possible they may have misinterpreted certain events or phenomena taking place in the home. More often than not, the photographic evidence of the alleged haunting came under the most scrutiny, with some believing the entity is nothing more than an overexposed photograph. And of course, all of this supposed evidence simply points to confirmation bias. Doris Bither and the investigators believed the home was haunted, so they interpreted the alleged evidence and manifestations as the work of an entity. Despite the controversy, the story of Doris Bither endures to this day, nearly 50 years later. In 1978, Frank D. Felitta published a fictionalized, and in some places embellished, account of the Doris Bither haunting. His novel, The Entity, was a huge seller at the time, and it was later adapted for film. In 1982, a graphic and terrifying film, also entitled The Entity, was released in theaters across the United States. It was met with acclaim by the investigators who knew the story of Doris Bither, by Frank D. Felitta, and by Doris Bither herself. After moving out of the home in Carson, California, Doris Bither fell off the radar and was never heard from investigators again. She died in 1999. I'll admit, this case leaves me feeling uncertain. I think it's important to say up front, Doris Bither not only claimed her home was haunted, she also claimed she was sexually assaulted by the spirits invading her home. I don't know if Doris Bither was attacked by ghosts, or if she was assaulted by human monsters. Regardless, it is equally important to believe sexual assault survivors when they disclose their experiences. In that sense, I am thankful Dr. Taff and Dr. Gaynor referred Doris to a mental health professional for further assessment. The ethos of do no harm cannot be overstated. With regards to the poltergeist activity in the home, I've always left the door wide open for this sort of phenomenon. It seems obvious, based on the over 24 eyewitness accounts, that something scary was happening in the home, and that Doris was the main target. For me then, the question is not was the haunting real? Rather, it's why was Doris Bither the target? As of now, I haven't read Frank De Felitta's novel, though I did purchase it last week and plan to read it in the next few days. And I haven't seen the movie, which stars Barbara Hershey in the title role. The fact that the book and movie exist tell me the evidence was compelling enough for some people. But, like most other cases, we may never know the full truth. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're left with these lingering questions. Was Doris Bither truly terrorized and assaulted by invisible entities? Or were the supposed hauntings something else entirely? I've shared the story. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.